80 quakes in 24 hours. That is the number rattling through Italian news feeds right now, a swarm of tremors shaking the ground beneath one of the most dangerous volcanic systems on the entire planet, a place sitting directly underneath more than 3 million people, who are trying to decide whether to sleep in their beds tonight or sleep in their cars. And the most unsettling thing about this story is not the shaking. It is what Italian officials are refusing to say, a single word they have publicly avoided for decades, while the ground beneath their feet has risen by more than 1.5 meters, and the seismographs have not stopped pinging since summer began. The supervolcano is Campi Flegrei, the Phlegraean Fields, a 12-kilometer-wide caldera on the western edge of Naples that most of the world had never heard of until the past few years, when the ground started behaving in ways that no one in living memory has ever experienced. On the evening of July 31st, 2026, at 7:46 p.m. local time, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake struck the caldera. It was the strongest tremor to hit the area in 40 years, surpassing anything recorded since continuous instrumental monitoring began, and it broke a stretch of coastline in Pozzuoli, shattered windows across Naples, toppled chunks of a cliff onto parked cars, damaged the local pier, collapsed part of a high-voltage pylon that cut power to roughly 100,000 households, and sent terrified residents pouring into the streets. Within hours, the Italian National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the agency known by its acronym INGV, was logging aftershock after aftershock. Rescuers climbed through collapsed stairwells with ladders to extract bedridden pensioners from condemned buildings. By the next morning, the bulletin was unambiguous. INGV had counted 129 earthquakes under the Phlegraean Fields since Friday evening, and agency trackers separately noted 80 or more aftershocks compressed into a roughly 21-hour window after the main shock. Roughly 60 of those tremors, including one of magnitude 3.1 that woke the towns of Boccoli, Pozzuoli, and Naples just before dawn, were large enough for residents to actually feel. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Campi Flegrei actually is, and the word that Italian officials keep avoiding is the word eruption. That is the E word in the title of this video. Italian civil protection authorities and the scientists at INGV have not declared any move toward an eruption. They have not used that word in a public bulletin during the current crisis. They have not upgraded the alert level above yellow, the second of 4 colors on Italy's volcanic alert scale, where yellow means attention and the next rung, orange, would mean something very different for several million residents of the Naples metropolitan area. And that silence on a single word is precisely what is terrifying the people who live above the caldera, because the data on the ground is doing something the language is refusing to match. This is not a normal volcano. You will sometimes see Campi Flegrei called a supervolcano in international media, and the classification is based on its geological past, not on what it is doing today. Roughly 39,000 years ago, the caldera produced the Campanian ignimbrite eruption, a colossal event that ejected an estimated 300 to 500 cubic kilometers of volcanic material, and is classified by seismologists as a VEI 7, the highest category on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. That eruption is the largest known volcanic event in Europe in the past 200,000 years. In modern climate, scientists have linked it to a sharp cold snap in the northern hemisphere that reshaped early human populations across the continent. About 15,000 years later, the same system produced the Neapolitan Yellow Tuff eruption, another explosive episode that finished carving the present-day caldera bowl, a depression roughly 12 kilometers. Years across that contains more than 20 craters and volcanic edifices, including the still active Solfatara crater and the Picciarelli fumarole field, both of which vent steam, sulfur, and carbon dioxide to this day. The last eruption the volcano actually produced in historical times was small by comparison, but historically striking. In 1538, a vent opened near the fishing village of Tripergole, and over the course of about a week built a new hill that the locals named Monte Nuovo, the new mountain. That eruption killed dozens of people, reshaped the coastline of the Gulf of Pozzuoli, and is the only eruption the caldera has produced in the past several thousand years. Everything since then has been quiet on the surface and deeply restless underneath. That restlessness has a name. It is called bradyseism, from the Greek words for slow and earthquake, and it describes the slow vertical movement of the ground that Campi Flegrei is famous for. The caldera does not just sit there. It breathes. Sometimes the ground rises. Sometimes it sinks. The most recent escalation began in 2005, and has not stopped. By the end of March 2026, the reference point at Rione Terra in Pozzuoli, which sits almost directly over the spot of maximum deformation, had risen by roughly 163.5 centimeters since the start of the current episode, and roughly 25.5 centimeters of that uplift had accumulated since January 2025 alone. The average rate measured by INGV week after week has been about 15 millimeters per month, give or take 3, but the institution has publicly stated that during certain periods, the uplift rate has exceeded 30 millimeters per month before easing back to lower values. For a city built on Roman ruins and medieval ports, even 15 millimeters a month is a slow-motion emergency. Buildings that have stood for centuries are slowly being levered apart by their own foundations. Streets they once met level now meet at angles, and the worst affected blocks of the historic center look, to anyone willing to look closely, like a city being silently pulled upward from underneath. Then came the earthquakes. Because the Bradycism and the seismicity are not separate stories. They are the same story, told in 2 different frequency bands. Through 2023, INGV recorded roughly 90% of local earthquakes at magnitudes below 1.0, which is to say most of the shaking was too small for people to feel. But the count kept climbing. In 2023, the strongest events were a magnitude of 4.2 on September 27th and a magnitude 4.0 on October 2nd. In 2024, a magnitude 4.4 hit the Solfatara area of Pozzuoli on May 20th. In 2025, a magnitude 4.4 struck on May 13th, and a magnitude 4.6 occurred offshore in the Gulf of Pozzuoli on June 30th, strong enough to damage structures in Pozzuoli and to be felt across the bay. By the spring of 2026, the pattern was clear. The earthquakes were not only becoming more frequent, they were becoming stronger, and their depth profiles were repeating themselves in a way that volcanologists had seen before, in earlier crises at the same caldera. On May 21st, 2026, a magnitude 4.4 hit at 3:50 in the morning UTC, the strongest event of that particular day, at a depth of roughly 3 kilometers. INGV called it the leading shock of a swarm of 12 events, all concentrated offshore between Pozzuoli and Boccoli. The municipality of Naples ordered precautionary school closures in the Bagnoli Fuorigrada red zone while inspectors fanned out across public and private buildings. That sequence, published in full on INGV's earthquake portal, was a minor preview of what July would bring. The May 21st swarm ended within hours. The July 31st swarm did not. Within roughly 22 hours after the main 4.7 shock, INGV had logged more than 80 aftershocks, and the broader tally, extending through the weekend, crossed 129. To understand the depth angle, you have to know what INGV is actually measuring. Almost every significant event in this recent crisis has been very shallow in the first 2 to 4 kilometers of crust beneath the caldera, with many of the largest events right around 2 to 3 kilometers down. The July 31st magnitude 4.7 was no exception. INGV placed it at roughly a 3-kilometer depth, so shallow that the seismic waves barely had to travel through anything before reaching the houses, the schools, the hospitals, and the rail tunnels of the western Naples metropolitan area. The hypocenter sat practically on top of the residential districts of Pozzuoli and Boccoli. That shallow arm of the faulting system is exactly the arm that was activated during the famous Bradyseismic crisis of 1982 to 1984, when the town of Pozzuoli, then home to about 40,000 people, was so badly shaken, along with the surrounding neighborhoods, that Italian authorities evacuated the historic center of Rione Terra entirely. The earlier crisis produced roughly 3.5 meters of cumulative uplift and thousands of felt earthquakes, and it remains the reference point against which every Italian volcanologist is currently comparing the present data. You can hear that comparison hiding in plain sight inside official communications. The Italian Civil Protection Department, in its own English language page on the current crisis, states that ground uplifts and earthquake magnitudes are now comparable to those experienced in the Bradyseismic crisis of the 1980s, while the impact on buildings and infrastructure is so far very different, primarily because most of the buildings in the affected municipalities are now reinforced concrete or retrofitted masonry of 3 stories or fewer, constructed to seismic codes that came in to force after the destructive Campania Basilicata earthquake of 1980. The same civil protection page also notes that the National Major Risks Commission concluded there is additional evidence of deep-seated magma beneath the caldera as the root cause of the current crisis, but because there is no proof of magma actually moving upward, the Commission has chosen to confirm the yellow alert level. That single sentence is the official explanation for the E-word silence. They are watching for an indicator that, in their protocol, would trigger a different color, and the indicator has not yet appeared. Until it does, the language stays calibrated. There's another reason the wording is restrained, and it is not just bureaucratic caution. The science itself is in active disagreement about what is happening underneath Pozzuoli, and the disagreement is published in peer-reviewed journals. One camp of researchers argues that the current crisis is being driven by the intrusion of magma into the shallow crust beneath the caldera. a process that, if it continued, would eventually provide the heat and volatiles needed for an eruption. Another camp argues the data is more consistent with pressurization of the shallow hydrothermal system by deeper fluids and heat, a process that can mimic many of the surface signatures of magma intrusion without necessarily progressing toward an eruption. Italian scientists at INGV and their international collaborators have published studies pointing in both directions. A Stanford-led research team published work in 2025 that identified a specific fluid mechanism linking groundwater infiltration to the pressurization of the hydrothermal reservoir underneath the caldera, and proposed that managing those water flow paths might, theoretically, reduce the unrest. A separate machine learning study published on phys.org in early 2026 used artificial intelligence to reprocess historical seismic records and recovered hidden patterns suggesting that the earthquake patterns beneath Campi Flegrei are far more complex than the simple linear story that older models assumed. The honest summary is that the caldera is undeniably pressurizing and destabilizing, that there's a real magma presence at depth confirmed by seismological imaging, but that the path from current conditions to an actual eruption is not mechanically predetermined. There is wobble room in the system. The E word stays off the table because the official response system is built around observable thresholds, not probabilistic forecasts. That build of word choice is what is making the residents of Pozzuoli, Boccoli, and the western neighborhoods of Naples feel gaslit at a moment when their walls are cracking. On the night of July 31st, 21 people were taken to hospital, 2 of them in serious condition. Reports a few days later put the injury count at 26, with about 300 people evacuated from their homes after landslides in the hills above the town. 9 buildings were officially declared structurally unsafe. Firefighters received calls about trapped elevators and damaged apartment stairwells. An 80-year-old bedridden man was evacuated from his building by a ladder truck after the stairwell of his apartment block was condemned. The famous Solfatara crater, the live fumarole field that has been venting steam and sulfur for centuries and sits just inland from the port of Pozzuoli, was visibly shedding rocks that crushed parked cars below it. The Port Authority declared the Pozzuoli pier unusable, suspending ferry and hydrofoil services to the islands of Ischia and Procida, stranding residents who depend on those crossings for work and medical appointments. High space, derail passengers experienced delays of up to 6 hours as bridge and tunnel inspections ran along the corridor. And across Naples, thousands of people who had no emergency kit prepared spent the night in their cars, gathered in piazzas, or refused to go back indoors until engineers could certify that their ceilings would hold through the next swarm. Celebrations marking the centenary of SSC Napoli, the city's football club, were interrupted by an earthquake that many residents said was unlike anything they had ever felt. Through it all, the most striking thing, and the thing that has turned this local crisis into an international news story, has been the steady drumbeat of background signals. The Pisciarelli fumarole field, a smaller venting area adjacent to the Solfatara crater, has shown in published research a steady escalation of carbon dioxide degassing over the past several years, consistent with a hydrothermal system under increasing pressure. INGV's weekly bulletins throughout 2026 continue to report an average uplift rate of roughly 15 millimeters per month, with individual weeks showing periods of faster ground movement. The seismic energy released per month has been climbing against a flat background that was already elevated, and the depth of the largest events has consistently fallen inside the 2 to 4 kilometer shallowness band that INGV considers the most worrying in its current scenario tree. INGV ran an all-time carbon dioxide high reading at one of its reference sites in April 2026. None of these individual indicators have crossed the threshold for an orange level escalation, but taken together, they have created an atmosphere in which the population, the media, and outside observers are increasingly impatient with the yellow level and with the language that holds it in place. It is worth being very precise about what officials have and have not claimed. Italy's Civil Protection Department stated, in plain language quoted in major outlets including Reuters and The Guardian, that the July 31st event was part of the current bradyseismic evolution of the caldera and not a separate tectonic earthquake driven by a different fault system. INGV's official communications state that the swarm sequence of the past months is consistent with the ongoing unrest, and that monitoring at all levels continues with heightened attention. The mayor of Pozzuoli, Gigi Manzoni, in his own statements, has emphasized the absence of immediate structural collapses and the deployment of municipal and civil protection patrols, noting that his office had been in immediate contact with INGV and with regional authorities within minutes of the main shock. Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani publicly committed to full assistance for displaced residents and to the long-promised redevelopment of buildings declared unfit for use. Civil Protection Minister Nello Musumeci urged continued caution and warned that the volcanic activity was not yet over. Above all of these statements sits the line that the agency tracker from ING has now taken to repeating almost by rote, that the swarm is consistent with the ongoing Brady seismic phase, and that no precursor to an eruption has yet been identified. Notice what is missing from this constellation of official statements. Nobody has said we will not have an eruption. Nobody has said this caldera is safe. They have said we are monitoring, the alert level is yellow, and we are not yet at the orange threshold. That careful language is correct as a public communication strategy, because it does not lie in either direction. It is also why the public feels the silence loudly. The experts are saying the only word they believe themselves authorized to say, which is yet. If you want to know what an orange level declaration would actually change, it is worth knowing the structure of Italy's risk planning. The National Emergency Plan for the Phlegraean Fields divides the territory into zones of escalating danger based on the location of the probable vent. And it sets out phased evacuation procedures that could, in the most extreme scenario, move hundreds of thousands of residents in a coordinated movement that would be one of the largest peacetime logistical operations in European history. Civil protection documentation references an evacuation window of 48 to 72 hours for moving the most exposed populations to safe areas, and the plan explicitly assumes that roads, bridges, and rail infrastructure may themselves be damaged in the lead-up. The same plan ties the alert color to specific observable thresholds, primarily evidence of magma moving toward the surface, increased thermal anomalies, and a sharp acceleration. In seismicity or deformation that would change the probability calculus for an eruption in days rather than months. Italian government modeling has long assumed a vent location uncertainty envelope, meaning the precise spot where magma might break through the surface could be almost anywhere inside the caldera rim, which is exactly why the red zone around Campi Flegrei is so wide. Right now, none of those thresholds have been tripped by the official criteria. The yellow level continues to hold. What makes the moment difficult to read is that the data is moving along a curve that resembles past crises, while not yet breaking any of those past crises. The total cumulative uplift of 163.5 centimeters is approaching levels not seen since the 19th century, and Italian researchers have modeled scenarios in which continued uplift of this kind could, in the coming years, lead to the crust beneath the caldera crossing a critical threshold where fractures become self-sustaining and the probability of an eruptive pathway jumps sharply. Published scenarios from ORCRCOV and from peer-reviewed journals such as the Bulletin of Volcanology have projected that, under current trends, ground uplift could reach approximately 4 meters by the early 2030-40s if the deformation continues at comparable rates. Those scenarios are not predictions. They are stress tests for planning purposes. They assume the current drivers continue without resolving themselves through hydrothermal venting or fluid migration. The fact that such models exist in the official discussion is itself a marker of how the responsible institutions are taking the situation seriously, even as they maintain the yellow alert in the absence of an explicit precursor. What makes the human side of this story so difficult is the long arc of the crisis itself. People in Pozzuoli have been living with the slow-moving nightmare of Bradyseism for 21 years now, since 2005. Many of them were children in 2005, when the recent uplift phase began. They have grown up watching the cracks in their schools lengthen, watching the harbor exposed by falling sea levels dry out and refill, watching their parents argue about whether to stay or sell. The 2023 swarm, with the magnitude 4.2 and 4.0 events on consecutive weeks, was when the first serious wave of public anxiety returned. The 2024 building assessments marked the first time the Civil Protection Department began openly discussing the comparisons with the 1980s. The May 25th, 2026, school closures for inspection marked the first time parents in Bagnoli and Fuorigrotta received an emergency notification on their phones, telling them to keep their children home. And the July 31st 4.7, which with 80-plus aftershocks and 129 events tallied by INGV, was the first moment the world outside Naples paid sustained attention to what had been unfolding for 2 decades underneath 3 million people. What is the responsible takeaway for the 3 million people who live on or around this caldera, and for the millions more who live within range of a possible eruption's effects? First, the science is unambiguous that the caldera is in an active and escalating phase of unrest, with measurable ground, uplift, with earthquakes that are getting larger and shallower, and with hydrothermal degassing that is increasing across multiple monitoring stations. Second, the science is not yet unambiguous about whether the current phase will end like the 1982 to 1984 crisis, which ended without an eruption, or whether it will cross the thresholds that would trigger the next alert level. Third, Italian institutions are tracking the situation with one of the densest and most sophisticated volcanic monitoring networks in the world, and their communications are constrained by a deliberate protocol that is designed not to overwarn or underwarn. Fourth, the cluster of more than 80 quakes in 24 hours around the magnitude 4.7 main event, with 129 events counted over the broader window. Main GV is tracking, represents the kind of swarm sequence that, in the official scenario framework, sits very close to, but not quite at the boundary between more of the same and something qualitatively new. Fifth, and finally, the E-word silence is not a sign that nothing is happening. It is a sign that the official language tracks a specific protocol tied to specific thresholds, and those thresholds, as of the most recent INGV bulletin, have not been tripped. That is all it means. The caldera is on a knife edge measured in millimeters per month and fractions of a degree of subsurface temperature, and the most consequential number, which is the probability that the yellow alert is upgraded to orange in the next few weeks, is a number that no Italian scientist has placed on the record. So when you read a news headline that says 80 quakes in 24 hours, the right question is not whether they will erupt. The right question is whether the E-word is useful for understanding what is happening, or whether it is shorthand for the only part of the story that has not yet been spoken aloud. Right now, with 163 centimeters of accumulated uplift, with a magnitude 4.7 event that broke cliffs and piers in Pozzuoli, with more than 100 aftershocks in a single swarm, and with a yellow alert held in place by officials, who keep saying the word monitoring instead of the word eruption, the only honest answer is that we are sitting inside a window of uncertainty. The busiest urban volcanic zone in Europe is sliding deeper into that window week by week, and the calm that the language is built to project is real, but it is being measured against a moving threshold. That is the story behind the headline. If you found this breakdown useful, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the volcanic and seismic events that do not fit neatly into a single day's news cycle. Drop a comment below telling me whether you think the alert level should already be at orange, whether the current pace of escalation looks like the 1980 FOUP, our pattern or a new one, and whether you live anywhere near a volcanic system you have been watching with the same kind of uneasy attention. The next time a swarm like this lands in the news cycle, I want to be the channel that gives you the context before the headlines do, and I will see you in the next one.